Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com or alexmercedcoder.work. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to create this series of videos about trends in web development. As I've been studying web development, I've been studying not just web development and like how to do it, but also studying the history, sort of market trends, stuff like that. There's a lot of things that kind of really stick out to me that are really interesting, so I figured I would do them over several videos. So in this video, what I want to do is talk about WebAssembly. So first, let's just kind of talk about what WebAssembly is before we talk about why this is a trend and why this is something that you should be following if you're in the web development space. Not saying you need to go learn WebAssembly, but it's something definitely you should be following. Basically, up until recently, there was basically your browser really recognized, your average internet browser recognized three things: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So essentially everything on the front end, everything that the browser had to sort of crunch and produce for the client had to be done in those sort of three tool sets. And the thing is that, especially when you're talking about JavaScript, well, JavaScript can do pretty much, nowadays, pretty much anything. I mean, now with Node.js, you can do backend server work, being the only language in which you could currently do front-end and back-end work. Could do anything, but the problem is it's still a higher level language. It's a language that is built on top of another language, built on top of another language, built on top of another language. So it's not necessarily as efficient as something like programming in something like C or C++. And while for most web applications with today's servers, that doesn't necessarily matter much, what we do in the browser is growing. Okay, so what happened is that everyone kind of got together and agreed we need something that's sort of more low level, more efficient for the browser. But if the problem is, if you just sit there and say, hey, we're going to create a new language, that means developers have to learn a new language. If you sit there and you choose one of the existing languages, then there's a lot of politics with that. So the result was, how do we create a spec that is sort of that very efficient low level, that's instead of being the language that everyone's going to program to the browser in this more efficient way, it becomes the compilation target. So basically, when you create your programming language, you can take whatever programming language that you want, or create new ones, and then you just compile it to this new specification. That's WebAssembly. Okay. So far as sort of the two closest to the finish line, far as sort of being ways to really have access to WebAssembly, would be .NET and Rust. So Rust, if you're familiar, is a language. It's also meant to be sort of a very efficient language. So it's supposed to have the efficiency like C and C++, but also have a little bit more of the safety of a JavaScript, in the sense that, you know, when you're using languages like JavaScript and Python, the likeliness that you're going to do something very dangerous with your memory allocation is a lot less, because you're not dealing with pointers and whatnot. But because you can manage your memory with C and C++, those programs can run a lot faster, which is great for like 3D rendering and a lot of really sort of processing intense projects. So Rust was sort of an attempt to try to bridge that gap by Mozilla, and thus a very natural match for WebAssembly. So that's a thing. And then also Microsoft has been racing to try to create a way to compile your .NET code, that's F#, C#, VB.NET, into WebAssembly. And right now what they have is this framework called Blazor. So right now, essentially you have a runtime, a sort of virtual machine that is, so basically you don't compile the code currently into WebAssembly. Instead, what they did is they compiled a virtual machine into WebAssembly. And then you run the code in sort of the pseudo virtual machine. Which they've optimized and is cool, but once they're able to actually compile the code and create a compiler that compiles directly to WebAssembly, it'll be that much faster and that more robust a tool to use. But that's essentially sort of but there's other people who are creating new languages that are going to compile WebAssembly. People are taking existing languages and creating compilers, so eventually you might be able to compile JavaScript, Python, whatever, into WebAssembly. Now, for most sort of modern day web applications, is that sort of what you need? Maybe, maybe not. But the thing is that this opens up the door to all sorts of new sort of applications, like ideas like cloud gaming or 3D rendering at high levels, like playing games like Far Cry in the browser, become a possibility. But at the same time, this WebAssembly specification doesn't have to just be something that's in the browser. And that's another thing that's been happening. People are trying to create and expand the use of WebAssembly into other platforms. So eventually WebAssembly could be something that's just how mobile operating systems work. So maybe eventually iOS and Android will both just sort of, be able to accept WebAssembly, which means then again, when you compile WebAssembly, you'll be able to create mobile apps. You'll be able to create apps for desktop, apps for... So WebAssembly has a lot of sort of really interesting implications. If you haven't seen my website, which I'll link in the description, where I have like all these resources for learning web development, there's a couple lectures in there that are really interesting on WebAssembly that I highly recommend that you check out. But so WebAssembly is a growing thing. It's something that's going to be trending over the next several years. So it's really important that you follow that space. I'm not saying go learn Blazor and Rust tomorrow, but keep an eye on them. Doesn't hurt to get acquainted with the basics. So that way you're kind of following the space. But my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day. Enjoy. I'll keep bringing you these sort of 2020 and beyond trend videos. Thank you very much.